To begin, I will set the variables here. Have a clean screen, and we'll continue talking about the basics of variables and types and arithmetics in Python. So let us introduce a variable f. Let it be, let's say, 4.7. Obviously, the type of this variable will be float. Well, let's say for some purpose we want to do some operations with integers and we want to convert it. We can use the function int, which will convert f to an integer type. Guess what f would be now? Well, g would be now. G would be 4. So it didn't round f, but it took just the integer part of it. Well, if you want to round it properly, you can use the round function. So round f would be 5, or you can use round function with whatever number of significant figures you wanted to use. Well, here it's obviously, well, zeros go after 7, so it doesn't print them. So round is in general quite useful. We often need to deal with things like pi number, and for example, you can define these constants somewhere. Furthermore, there are places where this constant is already defined in Python. We're going to talk about them later, but you want to define these constant, but sometimes for calculation you need something less than that. Thus you can do round pi to, let's say, 4 significant figures. Well, we've been introducing several different variables, calling them with different names, and it was typically x or y or g or f or pi in this case. Obviously, you can call variable with one single letter, right? X. Or you can call it as long as you want, so you can have the variable's name is unknown, or you can use several words, but you can't obviously use spaces in the variable's name. So new variable equals 1 would give you an error, but if you use an underscore instead, it would work fine. Well, variable names are case sensitive. So if I say new variable, Python would know what I'm talking about. But if I say new variable, well, it will give me an error because I use the capital N here, capital V here, and that applies not only to the name of the variables, but to the function names and everything else. So Python is case sensitive, and that's important. Not all programming languages are like that. For example, Fortran, which is frequently used in by physicists, mathematicians, chemical engineers. Fortran is not sensitive to the keys. So you can introduce x equal 1. Oh, sorry, I think I had x equal 1, x and a small x equals to 6. And if I print x small, it will give me 6. And if I print x capital, it will give me 1. Well, obviously, the names like that are not very helpful unless you're plotting a mathematical function f of x, right? But typically for some real engineering calculations, you need to use more transparent names for your variables. So let's say if I have mass, I can call it M. If I have a volume, I can call it V. And if I want to calculate density, I can use the letter D. I think it would be a little bit more transparent than X, and introduce it as M over V. Or I can call it rho if I'd like, right? And I can print it out. The command print prints out the value of the variable or whatever you put here in parentheses. So for this case, well, you can say it's transparent, but I would say if you use the full words, mass equals 1000, volume equals 1, and density equals mass over volume, it will be even more transparent, and the variable names are not too long. So I think I recommend you using names like that. Well, a couple more things about the variables and also comparison of Python with other programming languages. Syntax in Python is not as strict as in in C++, for example. So as you noticed, none of these lines ended with a semicolon, which would be the case for the C++ code. So we can introduce variables like that. If you put a semicolon there, nothing is going to happen. It will be just the same instruction. So it's not going to give you an error. Well, the case when semicolon can be used is when you want to have several commands in one line. So for example, you are assigning A equals 1, B equals 2, and C equals 3, and doing all that in one line. You would have to split them with semicolon. Otherwise, if you type like that, it will give you an error. By the way, Python is quite insensitive to spaces. So I can say A equals 1, or I can say, oops, sorry. I don't see a reason for using this letter format, but this one could be more compact and used. I would prefer to put a one space here, but these number of spaces are not important. What's important is the number of spaces before your command. So in the beginning of the line, the indentation. But I will talk about it separately and not now. So the last note here would be when about using long variables names and actually long instructions. So if you use names like A, B, and C, well, your lines of code are typically quite short. And by the way, I want to emphasize, although that would work, I strongly do not recommend it because it worsens the readability of the code. So having assignment for each variable in a separate line would be better. So back to long lines. So if you have a long line, for example, you introduce a variable which is called final coordinate, which would be calculated as acceleration times time squared divided by 2 plus velocity. So I'm already getting quite far in these lines. So what we typically do in Python, we use a backslash to continue on a new line. So you can put a backslash and then press enter, and you will be able to continue on the new line as if you're typing in the same line here. So velocity times time plus initial coordinate. Obviously it gave me an error because well, acceleration is not defined, actually time is not defined, velocity and so on. So all these variables are not defined. Let me define them. Let me put acceleration equals 1, time equals 5, velocity equals 3, and initial coordinate. Better not to misspell your variables. And initial coordinate will be 100. Okay, I think now I defined all the variables there. I press up several times till I get to these expression. Oops. Well, that's certainly not what I was planning to do. So I need to get rid of these extra spaces here. Press enter, and it looks like it calculated my final coordinate here.